Wyoming Territory. 1883, the wind tore across the plains outside the town of Bent Creek, like it was trying to scrape the earth clean of hope. Odessa Ellery bent over the porch rail of the schoolhouse, tucking a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear. Her knuckles were red from the cold, but her eyes stayed soft as she helped a boy no older than 6 down from a mule. His sister followed, clutching a small cloth bundle in her hands and blinking up at Odessa, unsure. "They said you're the one who takes in children," the boy said, his voice brittle. "Mama's gone. She died 3 nights ago after the fever. Papa left before that. We do not have anyone else." Odessa crouched down, eye level with them. "What are your names?" "I'm Milo," he said, puffing up slightly, "and she's Macy." Macy nodded once, holding her brother's coat sleeve. "Well, Milo and Macy, I'm Odessa, and you are safe now." She held out both arms. After a pause, they stepped forward. Odessa wrapped them close, warm tears slipping down her cheeks. The schoolhouse behind her was just one room, but it had a stove, blankets, and enough food to last a week. Her kindness was what the townsfolk whispered about behind her back. They called her a fool for believing in kindness. "She'll run herself into the ground," Mrs. Talbot muttered at the general store. "Kindness does not fill a plate," said old Mr. Green when Odessa offered to patch his torn coat for free. But she remembered her mother's voice, tender and firm, saying, "Odessa, kindness is not weakness. It is the only thing that makes this world bearable." So she kept giving. A week later, the snow rolled in heavy and cruel. Odessa was hauling firewood with frozen fingers when a rider came over the hill, slumped in the saddle. His coat was torn, his hat gone, and blood showed dark against his shirt. She dropped the wood and ran. The man half fell, half stumbled off the horse, boots crunching in the snow. "Do you need help?" she asked, breathless. His head lifted. Even under the blood and grime, his eyes were sharp gray like river stones. "Not sure what I need," he muttered, "but I could use a place to stop dying." She caught his arm. "This way." Inside, she laid him down near the stove. The children peeked out from behind the curtain as she cleaned his wounds in silence. He had a bullet graze at his side and bruises across his ribs. "You a doctor?" he asked, voice hoarse. "No," she said, dabbing at the wound, "but I know enough." He winced. "You always help strangers. If they are bleeding in the snow, yes." His mouth curved just a little. "You are either the kindest woman I ever met, or the most foolish." She glanced up. "Maybe both." He stayed 2 nights. By the 3rd, he was sitting up, watching the children as they played with carved wooden animals by the fire. "You live here alone?" he asked her. "With Milo and Macy," she said softly. "I teach school in the daytime. They stay with me now. Their parents are gone." He studied her like she was something he had never seen before. "Name's Xander Oakes," he said finally. "I used to ride with a cattle outfit out of Montana. Took a job guarding a stagecoach. That is where the bullet came from. Robbers. Something like that. They left me for dead." He should have gone once he healed. But he did not. He helped chop wood. He repaired the fence. He braided Macy's hair one morning when she cried because Odessa was sick with fever. Odessa woke to see him carrying water across the room, brow furrowed, her shawl wrapped around his shoulders. "I will be fine," she whispered. "You do not have to be," he said. Outside, the townsfolk whispered again. "Why is that cowboy still there?" She took him in like a stray dog. "She is a fool." But Odessa saw how Xander looked at the children, how he stood behind her when she read to the class, arms crossed, eyes steady. One evening after supper, he stood beside her on the porch. The sky was streaked pink and gold. "You do not owe me anything," she said, not looking at him. "I know," he paused, "but I think I want to stay anyway." She turned to him slowly. "I have not had anyone stay before." He nodded, jaw tight. Then I will be the first." She did not reach for his hand. Instead, she leaned her shoulder against his. He did not pull away. And in that silence, something deep took root. Not fast, not loud, but strong. They called her a fool for believing in kindness. But that night, as Xander tucked Milo into bed and kissed Macy's forehead, Odessa stood in the doorway and smiled. Because a cowboy was proving them all wrong, one quiet act at a time. The thaw came slow that spring, coaxed out of the ground by sun and stubbornness. Odessa stood ankle-deep in mud behind the schoolhouse, sleeves rolled, coaxing spinach seeds into damp furrows. Xander knelt beside her, silent as always when his hands were busy with the earth. He'd taken to staying close, never in the way, never pressing, just there. "Never planted anything before," he said, not looking up. Her fingers paused, then kept working. "Nothing. No," he said. "Didn't seem worth it when I couldn't stay in one place long enough to watch it grow." The quiet between them lengthened, warm and not uncomfortable. The wind smelled of wet soil and the last melt of snow. Odessa brushed hair from her brow with the back of her wrist. "You think you'll stay long enough now?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. His fingers moved over the soil, gentle. "Doesn't feel like running, not here." She nodded, heart steady. She didn't ask for more than that. Not yet. Inside, Macy was helping Milo fold linen scraps into book covers for the children who'd be arriving come Monday. Odessa had ordered paper from Cheyenne, and it had come late, wrinkled from rain but still usable. They made do. They always had. Later that week, Xander repaired the door to the lean-to behind the schoolhouse. The hinges had been rusted near through, and he'd spent the better part of 2 hours with a rasp and oil, speaking only once. "Your hammer's nearly split." He held it out to her, handle cracked down the middle. She took it, weighing it in her palm. "It was my father's." He gave a small nod, not pitying. "I'll fix it. You don't have to. Don't want it breaking on you." That evening, the church bell rang late, long after the usual hour. Odessa looked up from the ledger she kept of school expenses, her brow drawing tight. Xander stood from where he'd been stringing a new line for drying herbs, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Fire?" he asked. "No. Reverend only rings like that when someone's gone missing." They didn't speak again until they reached the edge of town. Mr. Dillard was pacing in front of the mercantile, hat in hand. His daughter, Clara, hadn't come home from the river where she'd gone to gather catkins for the altar wreath. The sun was already dipping. "She's 12, Mr. Dillard said, voice cracking. "She knows that stretch of river better than I do. She don't just vanish." Odessa stepped forward. "We'll help." Xander didn't hesitate. He took the lantern from the reverend's hand before anyone offered it, checked the wick, and nodded once. Then he turned to Odessa. "You stay here. I'll follow the river." "I'm coming with you." His jaw worked, but he didn't argue. He just handed her the second lantern. The banks were slick and treacherous from snowmelt. They didn't speak as they walked. The lanterns cast long shadows over the reeds and roots. Somewhere far off, a night bird called. They found Clara huddled beneath a cedar, her foot wedged between 2 rocks. She wasn't crying, just quiet, like she'd already decided no one was coming. When Odessa touched her shoulder, Clara looked up with wide, dry eyes. "I didn't mean to get stuck," she said. "I know," Odessa whispered, kneeling. "We're here now." Xander freed her foot with gentle hands. He lifted her easily, holding her against his chest like she weighed nothing. On the walk back, Clara fell asleep against his shoulder. "Doesn't this make you want to leave?" Odessa asked after a stretch of silence. "What? This place? These people? Always needing something?" He glanced at her over the lantern light. "No, makes me want to build something that won't break when they lean on it." She didn't look away. Back at the schoolhouse, Odessa tucked Clara into the cot beside Macy and sat by the stove while the kettle hissed. Xander leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You ever think about what comes after all this?" She looked up. "After what?" The children grow. The school closes someday. The weather turns too hard. She watched his face, the way the firelight softened the line of his jaw. "I think about what's worth holding on to." His voice dropped low. "And what's that?" She stood, walked over to him, close but not yet touching. "The people who stay." His breath caught barely. "I'm not leaving." "I know," she said. "I'm glad." He didn't reach for her, just let his hand brush hers as they stood in that quiet space between night and dawn where something tender was beginning to take shape, not rushed, not uncertain, just real. The spring fair came to Bent Creek the second Saturday of May, when the cottonwoods along the creek swayed with new leaves, and the soil had begun to hold warmth through the night. Odessa stood in the schoolhouse doorway, her apron dusted with flour, watching as Xander hitched the mule cart. Macy sat beside him on the bench seat, clutching a pie she'd helped bake, her bonnet slightly crooked. Milo leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed. "I'm not dancing." "Nobody's asking you to," Odessa said, tying a ribbon at the back of her neck. "But you're coming." He rolled his eyes, but his boots followed when she stepped down. The fairgrounds were nothing more than a wide patch of grass behind the church, marked by canvas tents and a few sawhorse tables. Reverend Albright had organized a quilt raffle, and the blacksmith's wife was selling jam from stone crocks. Xander helped unload the cart in silence, setting the pie among the others without comment. Odessa noticed he kept glancing toward the far end of the field, where a few men were setting up a ring toss beside a battered fiddle player. She stepped beside him, brushing a bit of hay from his sleeve. "You ever been to one of these?" "Once," he said, eyes tracking a young couple walking hand in hand toward the lemonade stand. "Years ago, didn't stay long." "Why not?" "Didn't have a reason to." Macy ran up then, cheeks flushed. "They're letting people try the sack race." "Can I?" Odessa nodded. "Stay where we can see you." Xander watched her go, then looked down at Odessa, his voice lower than before. "You think she remembers what it felt like before?" Odessa folded her arms. "Sometimes, but children are like grass. They'll bend in the wind, but they grow toward the sun if you give them enough of it." He didn't reply, but his expression shifted. Later, after the ribbons were handed out and the sun had begun to lean west, Odessa wandered past the stalls, a jar of lemonade in her hands. She paused near the weaving tent, watching a woman demonstrate shuttle work. Xander found her there, holding a strip of hand-dyed cloth between his fingers. "You ever try this?" he asked. "No." "Looks like patience made visible." She smiled faintly. "That's what schooling feels like most days." He turned the cloth over once, then handed it back to the vendor. "I was thinking about what you said, about what's worth holding on to." She tilted her head. "And I reckon I've spent more of my life chasing things that wouldn't stay still. Land, money, men I owed or who owed me. I never thought to ask if any of it could hold me back." "You want to be held back." "I want to stop running." Odessa looked at him then, really looked. His hands were calloused, his boots worn, but his eyes, those gray eyes, held steady on hers without flinching. "I don't need promises," she said. "Just truth." He nodded once. "Then let me say this plain, I want a place that needs me. I want to wake up with 2 children hollering and a woman stirring coffee. I want to fix the roof before it leaks and plant something that'll keep." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "You already do those things," she said. He stepped closer, his voice soft. "Then say you'll let me keep doing them for you." The wind lifted her skirts, and somewhere behind them the fiddle struck up a slow reel. Odessa didn't answer with words. She reached for his hand, warm and solid, and held it tight between both of hers. They didn't dance, Not then. They simply stood there, palms pressed, the noise of the fair soft around them, and let the world turn gently toward something new. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Odessa stepped out onto the porch. Xander was already there, seated on the top step, elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting beside him. "Dangerous habit." She nudged his arm. "There's a stretch of field past the creek. Used to be pasture, nobody's worked it in years." He turned his head. "You want to farm?" "I want to grow roots. School will always be here, but the children outgrow it. I want something that stays." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "I drew this on a ledger page in town." She took it. It was a rough sketch, lines for fencing, a square marked barn, another home. Her name was written in the corner in small block letters. "You drew this for me, for us." She looked up, heart thudding. "Xander, I know I'm not the kind of man folks expected for you. But I'll carry the weight, all of it, if you'll let me." She leaned into his side, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "They called me a fool for believing in kindness." He laid his hand on top of hers. "Then let them. I'll be the fool who proves you right." And there, under the slow stars and the rising hush of crickets, they sat quiet together and no longer waiting. The first fence post went into the earth on a Tuesday, under a pale morning sky and the sharp cry of meadowlarks. Xander drove it deep with the post maul, shoulders moving slow and steady, while Odessa held it upright, her skirt hem pinned to her ankles with clothespins to keep it from dragging in the mud. They worked without chatter, not out of distance, but rhythm. The kind that came when two people had begun to move in time with one another without needing to ask. "You've done this before," she said, stepping back as he lifted the next post. "Not for myself," he replied. "Always someone else's land. Someone else's cattle." They paused between rows, her breath clouding lightly in the cool air. Across the field, Milo was helping Macy build a scarecrow from old grain sacks and a broken rake handle. Odessa watched as the children argued over the hat, then settled it with a compromise, a square of patterned cloth tied at the corners. "They've taken to you," she said. Xander set the post into the hole and looked over. "I've taken to them." A beat passed between them. "I've never asked how old you were when you left home," she said. 17, he answered. "Left with a saddle bag and a letter I never mailed." "What stopped you?" He shrugged. "Got caught up in other things. One job turned into another, then a winter too cold to go back." She didn't press. "I left home at 21. Took this teaching post thinking it'd be 1 year. That was 6 years ago. You stayed. I didn't know where else to go, and then the children kept coming." She turned her gaze to the schoolhouse roof, where a pair of mourning doves had built a nest along the eaves. "I think I needed someone to need me." Xander nodded once, then returned to the post hole. "I reckon we both did." That evening, Odessa found a jar of linseed oil and rubbed it into the porch rail where the wood had begun to splinter. The sun slipped low, casting long gold lines across the yard. Inside, Macy was humming to herself while she sorted buttons into a tin. Milo was bent over the slate board, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration. Xander came up the steps behind her with a quiet tread. "I took a ride to the South Ridge," he said. "Saw coyote tracks not far from the coop. I'll keep the hens in tomorrow. I'll set a trap line." She nodded, still working the oil into the grain. "This place asks a lot. Doesn't take more than it gives." Odessa's hands paused, then slowly set the cloth aside. "You said once you never planted anything. I remember. I have a packet of tobacco seed. My father used to grow it behind our house in Tennessee. I haven't touched it since he passed. You want to plant it?" She met his eyes. "I want to grow something we both come from." Xander's face changed at that, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if something he had carried for a long time had finally found a home. "I'll till a patch for it in the morning," he said. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his. "I'd like that." They stood together while the last light faded from the sky, the porch beneath them worn smooth by years of waiting. Neither reached for the other, but they stayed close, hands just touching, the silence between them full of decision. When night fell, Odessa lit a single lamp and set it in the window. She didn't need to say it. Xander would be there in the morning, and every morning after that. The first tobacco sprouts came up in neat rows, pale green and delicate as breath. Xander crouched beside them at dawn, brushing soil from the edge of a leaf with the back of his knuckle. Odessa watched from the door, apron strings hanging loose at her sides, hair still damp from washing. "You think they'll take?" she asked, stepping barefoot onto the porch boards. Xander looked up at her, eyes clear. "If the soil's right." She came down the steps slowly. "You trust it. I trust you." She crouched beside him, resting her hand on the earth. "I used to think trust was something you gave careful, like coin, but it's more like planting. You do it not knowing if it'll grow." Xander didn't reply, but his hand found hers where it rested in the dirt. He didn't squeeze, just held it. Their shadows stretched out behind them as the sun climbed. By late summer, the fence was finished, the chicken coop reinforced, and the schoolhouse roof re-shingled. Odessa held lessons beneath the cottonwoods when the air turned too thick to think indoors. The children read aloud between sips of well water and the hum of dragonflies. One afternoon, Xander wandered up with a pail of fresh berries from the south ridge, his shirt damp and his hat pulled low. He didn't speak when he handed her the pail, just tipped his head once. Odessa took it, brushing her fingers over his wrist as she did. "You always this quiet when you're content?" she asked. He set a boot on the bench rail and leaned his elbow to his knee. "Don't feel like something I need to speak over." Odessa looked down at the berries, deep red and sun-warmed. "You know, I never asked what you want for yourself." "Not for the land or the children, for you." He was quiet a long moment, then said, "I want to grow old with dirt under my nails and someone beside me who knows what it costs to get here." She met his gaze. "You already have both." A week later, Reverend Albright stopped by the schoolhouse with a folded paper in his hand. Odessa read it twice before speaking. "They've offered me a post in Laramie, larger school, steady wage, room for advancement." Xander was splitting kindling when she told him. He set the axe down with care. "You want it, I thought I might, years ago, but now." She trailed off, glancing toward the barn door where Macy's red kerchief hung drying and the tobacco leaves curled at the edges from the warm wind. "I don't need more. I need deeper." She looked up. "We've built something here, not just a life, but a place that holds." Xander nodded once, slowly. "Then we stay." The letter was returned with a thank you and a polite decline. The Reverend didn't ask questions. He only smiled as he folded his hands over the rail and said, "It's good when people choose each other." In early September, Odessa stood in the doorway of the barn, drying her hands on her skirt. Xander came in from the field, his shoulders streaked with dust, a thin line of sweat at his brow. She met him halfway. "I bought a bolt of muslin from Miss Talbot," she said. "Thinking of making curtains for the back room." He raised an eyebrow. "That for the children, for us. I want to move into the house proper. Not just sleep beside the stove or keep your boots by the door." He rested his hands on her hips, gentle. "You sure?" "I want to marry you, Xander." He didn't move right away, just looked at her with something behind his eyes that had never had words before. Then he said, "I've been yours since the first fence post." They married in the clearing beside the creek, where the cottonwoods arched overhead and the water whispered against the stones. Macy scattered dried petals from a tin pail. Milo stood straight as a pine, shirt tucked and hair combed flat. The whole town came, but it felt small, intimate, like something that had already been decided long ago and was only now being spoken aloud. Xander wore his only clean shirt, and Odessa had sewn a row of tiny glass buttons down the back of her dress. When the reverend closed the ceremony, Xander leaned down, kissed her not quick but steady, like he'd meant to for years. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep in the loft, Odessa stood by the window while Xander banked the fire. She listened to the soft crackle of coals and the call of a nighthawk far off over the ridge. "You still believe in kindness?" he asked, coming to stand behind her. She turned, resting her hands over his heart. "I believe in you." He pulled her close and she leaned into him, the two of them wrapped in the hush of a home that had been hard-won but real. Years passed. The tobacco grew tall and thick each summer. The children outgrew their shoes faster than she could stitch them. Xander built a second room off the back of the house when Macy needed her own space. Milo learned to sharpen tools and started helping the blacksmith on Saturdays. Odessa never sent another letter asking for anything else. And each morning, she woke beside the man who had once bled in the snow outside her door and now slept with one hand always resting near hers. They did not need to speak their love daily. It was in the way he left her the last biscuit, in the way she mended his shirts before he asked, in the way they moved through each season, not rushed, not perfect, but together. Their love was not loud. It was not sudden, but it held like fence posts driven deep, like roots that knew the shape of home.